Hello, and welcome to the second episode of my review of Blades in the Dark. In this episode, I'm going to talk about free play. And free play is a part of the game that I believe is perhaps the most important and also the least discussed in this book. So, I first want to just look at what is said about free play in the book, and then I'll get into why I think it's so important and how and in what way it might be discussed in the future. So to begin with, you can see on page 8 of the book, there's this discussion of the structure of the game, page 8 and 9. And it says on page 8 that by default, the game is in free play. Characters talk to each other, they go places, they do things, they make rolls as needed. And later on, after talking about scores and downtime, it says, when all the downtime activities are complete, the game returns to free play and the cycle starts over again. So there is a sense in this structure in which free play is a dictated phase of play. However, John Harper also writes, these phases are a conceptual model to help you organize the game. They're not meant to be rigid structures that restrict your options. This is why they're presented as amorphous blobs of ink without hard edges. Think of the phases as a menu of options to fit whatever it is you're trying to accomplish in play. Each phase suits a goal. During free play, the game is very fluid. You can easily skim past several events in a quick montage. Characters can disperse in time and space, doing various things as they please. And then it continues to go on to talk about scores and downtime. So free play, as described here, covers character scenes, actions and consequences, gathering information, choosing a target, and choosing a plan. And choosing a target and choosing a plan are set off from those other three options. And I think that's because choosing a target and choosing a plan are points that you are going to repeatedly hit in the cycle of play, going from downtime to a score and then back to downtime again. There's that bridging point between the downtime and the score where you're going to enter free play to decide how the score is set up. So the rest of the game, aside from free play, I would say, provides the key elements for free play. For free play scenes, as well as providing pacing and continuity for them. So if the game of Blades in the Dark was purely free play, which is to say the game was improv storytelling, with maybe a little bit of rules here and there to spice things up, which would make it more of a story game. If that was the case, then it's unlikely that Blades in the Dark would function as a long-term campaign game, because there are problems with running that kind of game in a campaign. Namely, you run into problems of pacing. It's exhausting to be in character scenes constantly. And you run into problems of continuity. Because if you are framing scenes in strictly a way to get at the most interesting character interactions, you may do a lot of flashbacks. You may do a lot of jumping from one thing to another, and this can create a confusing continuity that other rules and other styles of play can help to ameliorate. So I think what the rest of the game provides the free play scenes in Blades in the Dark. And this is a point that I'm kind of taking from the most recent Gauntlet podcast and their discussion of GM-less games, is it provides structure for free play, right? Because you can use action rolls, you can go to downtime activities, you can go from downtime activities into free play, and you can also see where free play leads by doing a score. And the rest of the game provides inspirational prompts for free play, which is to say it gives you a clear setting, and it gives you a clear reason to have scenes of free play, scenes of character interaction, scenes that describe the consequences of actions, and scenes where, you know, maybe the characters are doing investigative work in a kind of montage way. If the game was strictly montage, it would be a very short game. So that is what the rest of the game provides free play scenes, right? But why do I think that free play scenes are the core of Blades in the Dark? Well, it's not just because the text says that free play is the default of play, right? Because default is an ambiguous phrase or an ambiguous term. It could mean that it is the fundament, it is the central part of play, right? Because it is the default, you're going to return to it again and again. It could also mean that's just where you happen to start. It could also mean it's a kind of fail-safe, right? Like, if the rest of the game isn't working, then you default back to free play. So what does it really mean? In my opinion, I think that free play is actually the core of the game. And this is based on my experience playing Blades in the Dark, more than what the text tells us. There are some things in the text that support my view, but there's also things to suggest that it's otherwise, that free play is not central to the game. So what I would say is that if you run this game without a focus on free play, which I've done, and which I've seen other GMs do as well, it really falls apart. I talked about my original attempt to run this game being a disaster. One of the major problems that I had was that I didn't understand how important free play is to successfully running Blades in the Dark. So I was just going through the downtime and the scores, and it was not good. What ends up happening is that the players don't have any context for their decisions if you don't have free play. Why? They don't understand who their characters are. They don't understand what their motivations are. They don't understand what the setting is about. Maybe if they've read the book, then they can kind of go off of that, but you still end up losing a lot of local context that is relevant to decision making. And the rest of the game, aside from free play, is primarily about decision making. So free play provides context for the rest of the game, and the rest of the game, in the way that I described of providing structure and inspirational prompts for free play, it provides context for those free play scenes, right? So it's free play provides context for the rest of the game. The rest of the game provides context for free play. That's a healthy cycle, a healthy system. And I still think that even though this is a two-way street, the core location, the core locus of where the meaning is in a game of Blades in the Dark is in free play. Because if you don't have it, then you just have decision making without meaning. And this is something that John Harper actually does mention in the book. On page 161 of the book, he does say this. Fiction first gaming, right? He's talking about fiction first gaming. What is fiction first gaming? So he describes how board games work, how they are driven by their mechanics, and why they could be called mechanics first games, right? So he says, what you do on your turn is pick a mechanic to engage, then resolve that mechanic. Your choices are constrained by the mechanics of the game. You might color it in with some fictional trappings like, the brave citizens of Baronia heed the call to war and build a stout fort. But the fiction is secondary. It's flavor added on. In other words, the fiction is brought in after the mechanics to describe what happened. Then he describes what role-playing games, including Blades in the Dark, do. In a role-playing game, it's different. When it's your turn, you say what your character does within the ongoing fictional narrative. You don't pick a mechanic first, you say something about the fiction first. Your choices in a role-playing game aren't immediately constrained by the mechanics. They're constrained by the established fictional situation. In other words, the mechanics are brought in after the fictional action has determined which mechanics we need to use. And then he goes on to say, for example, in Blades in the Dark, there are several different mechanics that might be used if a character tries to pick the lock on a safe. And this is the important part. It's essentially meaningless to play mechanics first. I pick a lock is not a mechanical choice in the game. To understand which mechanic to use, we have to first establish the fiction. And that is why I think that free play is the core of this game. It is meaningless to foreground or to put the primary emphasis on the rest of the game. It should be on free play because the fiction arises in a meaningful way within free play, and that is what is going to provide the fictional positioning that makes the mechanics meaningful, makes them work. However, just because we have this one very telling page in the description of how to play the game, it doesn't mean that that is a point that is shoved in your face as a reader of this book. And actually, what I have seen is, especially in in sessions of Blades in the Dark that are not working, there is a common, unprompted, and I would say unconnected, right? Like this is feedback that is coming from different groups who don't know each other, but say the same thing, and they say so without prompting by the GM. It's not they're not answering a direct question. They're just giving unstructured feedback. And they say Blades in the Dark feels like a board game. Well, that's the exact opposite of what John Harper is saying this game should play like, right? Because he's saying, well, here's board games, here's what we're not doing, and then there's role-playing games, which is what we are doing. But I've had this in my games, and I've seen it in other GMs' games as well. People say, "Oh, Blades in the Dark feels like a board game. Um, it feels like a mechanics-driven game," and that's because the game is not being presented to them in the way that it was intended. Um, and I strongly believe that's the case. I strongly believe that this is supposed to be a fiction first game. Um, and I think the reason why this happens is because free play is hugely underemphasized in the text of Blades in the Dark, given its enormous importance. Um, there is a tangential mention of it at the start of the downtime phase discussion. When it talks about downtime, it talks about a little bit about how free play is important to doing the downtime phase. So, for example, we go to 145. After the crew finishes a score, succeed or fail, they take time to recover, regroup, and prepare for the next operation. This phase of the game is called downtime. Downtime fulfills two purposes in the game. First, it's a break for the players. I don't think that's true. Having run numerous downtime phases and seeing how intense downtime can be when you are resource constrained, I don't think the downtime provides a break for the players unless you're at the start of the campaign. Anyhow, we're going to talk about that in the downtime phase review. During the action of the score, the PCs are always under threat, charging from obstacle to obstacle in a high energy sequence. Downtime gives them a reprieve so they can catch their breath and relax a bit. Focus on lower energy, quieter elements of the game, as well as explore personal aspects of their characters. And that's the important part. That's where that's where John Harper is gesturing towards free play and its significance. And then he talks about the importance of the mechanics within downtime. There's of course the page 8 and 9 discussion that I talked about at the beginning of this review, talking about free play, and there is also, aside from the thing about fiction first gaming that I discussed already, on page 188, there is this section here of the GM actions that puts at the top of the list for things the GM should do in the game is to ask questions. First and foremost, ask questions. You can get along very well as a GM by simply asking questions, building on the answers, asking more questions, answering them with dice rolls, and so on. Asking questions is the heart and soul of running a role-playing game. So that could mean a number of things, but he actually does tell us what sort of questions to ask. So, establishing questions to set the stage for action, provocative questions to make the players think and express their characters, leading questions to show the players what you're thinking. So this is, to communicate by means of a question where you want the scene to go. Trivial questions, when the mood strikes you and you're curious, which are, scene painting and adding flavor, right? And then asking the players for help when you're uncertain or stuck, and that is kind of a rules or decision-making delegation thing, which is unrelated to free play. But yeah, these questions, asking them is a key part of how to do free play. The issue is that it doesn't really tell you how to follow up on that, right? Like, it's it's perfectly possible to ask these questions and then say, okay, good, let's move on, and get back to the rules, right? To get back to the mechanics. And I think that's something that can happen. So given these issues, given this limited attention that is given to free play in the text of Blades in the Dark, how did I get over that, right? Like, because that's where I started. I started in a position as a GM of not really understanding the game and having a lot of trouble running it. Well, how did I get over it? Well, it wasn't by reading the book. It was actually from watching John Harper run Blades in the Dark on Roleplay Blades, and also watching him run 316, an actual play of 316. What really jumped out for me is in Roleplay Blades, he spends like, the entire first session of play in free play? He does nothing but establish the characters. And in 316, at least the first section of play, the first good, hour or so of play, has almost no dice rolling at all, and is just a lot of skillful narration, scene setting, and question asking on the part of John Harper to set up the game. And if you wanted to run that game without doing any of that stuff, you would not be violating the rules in any meaningful sense, right? This is just how John Harper GMs games. And the problem is that we're not all John Harper. So we have to learn how to make sense of how he was thinking in writing this game. And it's fantastic that he's done those actual plays, because it's really informative. I have to say, as a critic, that the text does not communicate that very well. And I think the primary problem is that the way free play is addressed in this text is extremely diffuse. You find it here and there throughout the text. It's not given the spotlight. And, this is something that a GM will probably learn. If you're a GM or if you're a teacher, you'll probably learn that sometimes you have to hit your audience over the head with what you're trying to say. You have to be obvious rather than subtle. And I think this is a little bit too subtle. So that would be my primary criticism. It's too diffuse, it's too subtle. And it assumes too much is actually known by the reader. So what I think needs to be learned is that being fiction first means knowing when to refrain from pushing towards the mechanics. So yes, asking questions is important. Yes, you need to know when to go to free play. However, you also need to know when to stay in free play. When to let the scene breathe. And that is a fine art and something that is difficult to convey without actually having experience with somebody who does it at the table. So I'm not saying the mistakes made in the composition of this text are things that are obvious and were overlooked. I'm saying that it doesn't do a very good job of communicating something that is very difficult to communicate. But I want to kind of say, instead of just giving a lot of criticism, I want to say two things in conclusion. The first is that when you do understand the importance of free play to Blades in the Dark, the game does an excellent job of supporting free play because it's designed to do that. right? It's not like it was something neglected in the design of the game. It's just that it's not clearly communicated how important it is, but it is a part of the design. And when you stick it in there and you start to run with it, you'll see, oh wow, this works great, because that's why it was constructed the way it is. And the other thing I would like to say in conclusion is I don't really want to see like I don't want to see a second edition of Blades in the Dark in a hurry, right? I don't want to see a full revision of the text quite yet. I don't think it's time for that yet. And I also don't really want to see a lot of splat books for Blades in the Dark. And I know that, Blades in the Dark is an indie game, and generally speaking, indie authors have an aversion to putting out a lot of supplements for their games. So I can absolutely understand if that is not done. But what I would like to see in the future as a way of remedying the problems with the text is something like the Burning Wheel Codex. Because the Burning Wheel Codex does a lot of the sort of thing that I'm talking about here. And if you take a look at the description of what the Codex is, so it says here, Codex Ignis. The Codex should be dead. Its pages should be lifeless bones of old ideas packed between two covers and dumped into your lap. It contains no new material. Everything within has been published before in one form or another. So what good is it? Why not write a new supplement? Why use this old dross? Fair questions. Allow us to answer. In 2011, we published the definitive edition of Burning Wheel. It has taken 5 years for the ideas of that edition to settle, and for the need for more material to build to a boil. In the Codex, we chose to include the Adventure Burner, Commentary, Arcane Library, Magical Artifacts, and the Monstrous Life Path, so not relevant to Blades in the Dark. And I think you will see, we have spun this dross into gold. We have taken the best material published, tested it, distilled it, and refined it. This is no mere regurgitation. We took a hammer to the metal and beat it into shape until it glowed with purpose and pattern. Through our efforts, we have created the perfect companion to Burning Wheel Gold, which is the main text of the Burning Wheel. The material in the Codex adds no weight to the game. To the contrary, it provides breadth and depth, ultimately lightening the load gold bears. This tome works for you. It provides. Shimmering, it shall guide you down new and wondrous paths to create ever better stories, ever more memorable characters. This codex is stamped with the mark of more than 10 years of our blood and sweat. We are proud to put it in your hands and hope it brings light into your life. So that's what I want to see down the line, because obviously, 5 years have not elapsed since the release of Blades in the Dark. But that is what I want to see in the future for Blades in the Dark, is a text like the Burning Wheel Codex that takes the conversations that have emerged around the game and summarizes them in such a way that they are focused and easy to follow. So, for example, at the start of the Codex, the first thing they talk about is how to play the Burning Wheel. And just gives you very, bird's eye view of what is this game about, how should you play it, how should you run it. And that's what I think we need for Blades in the Dark. And I think that's what's going to bring free play to the center of the discussion and make it clear just how it should be done. So this has been a fairly critical episode of my review about the game, but I do want to say this section of the game actually works very well once you understand what it's about. And I think there's a lot of room for this section to be further developed and to grow going forward. I don't think this is in any sense a failure. I just think it is innate to the first edition of a game that there are some parts that are less well communicated than others. So, speaking of parts that are well communicated, you might say, we're going to go and talk about scores in the next episode, and I think I'll have a lot more glowing things to say about the game at that point. So I will see you then.